We're here today with Lant Pritchett, an American Development Economist. He is currently a visiting professor of practice at the London School of Economics, School of Public Policy, and we'll be talking with him today about education in India. So the government has had, I'd say, big focus on education over maybe the last 2 decades here in India. And do you think that's contributed to the growth of the nation? How do you think that's changed India over the last 2 decades?
So I think the government's had a big focus on schooling. And people treat schooling and education as if they're synonyms. But schooling, properly, is kind of butts in seats. Did kids show up? Did they stay in the building? And did they persist through a number of years? That's just an outcome measure of schooling. India, like most countries around the world, has been fantastically successful at schooling, at expanding the number of kids, at expanding how long kids are in school. The problem is people have conflated the emphasis on schooling with an emphasis on education. But in India, as in many other countries, the thing that would make schooling education is learning. How much are you actually learning per year? Are you learning relevant skills? Are you gaining competencies? And that's been amazingly low. And it's amazingly well documented in India how low it is. And so schooling has contributed because kids are learning something. It's not like they're learning nothing, but they're not learning anywhere near the level of skills and ability to apply those skills to the world they face. For one to declare, the focus on education to have made a major contribution to the economy. And in fact, there's a risk that the expectations youth have about the jobs they will have because of their schooling is far out of touch with the actual skills they would need to have those jobs. So it's contributed in part, but it's also created major risks, both economically and politically, in the sense that you have schooled youth who feel entitled to jobs corresponding to the level of schooling they have, but they don't actually have the learning skills and competencies for those kinds of jobs.
So you feel that the Indian youth right now as a demographic is unprepared to join the labor force with the level of schooling they've received?
I think radically underprepared. I've been working over many years with Rukmini Banerjee, who with Madhav Chavan is head of Pratham, and they do this annual survey of education, ASER, and twice now they've done, usually ASER has been focused on younger children, but twice they've done focus on youth 14 to 18. What's really unbelievably shocking is that for the simplest possible application of things you should have learned in school, like how to take percentages, the youth just are radically unprepared. So if you show, like, here's a shirt listed for 300 rupee, it's on sale for 10%, what's the, 10% off, what's the price? Like, what's shocking is youth who are enrolled in tertiary education don't get that question right.
Okay.
So you have youth who are expecting, college level, university level jobs who can't calculate a simple percentage. I mean, this isn't like a hugely complex question. So the main, problem with the Indian education system is it has been focused to the extent it's to the extent that it's been focused on learning, it's been focused on memorization. It's been focused on procedures. It's been focused on rote repetition back of things you're told, and not depth of understanding, not conceptual mastery of things that you could then apply. So in some sense, the only thing schooling prepared students for was schooling. It prepared you to pass exams to get more schooling. But whether that schooling was actually preparing you to have skills and competencies in the job market, in the real world, it's radically underprepared youth for the jobs that they want and that the Indian economy needs.
Okay, that's a pretty drastic gap to talk about. What do you think can be done to change a system like this? to move the shift away from schooling, as you
Yeah.
just focusing on schooling, as you call it? Yeah.
So I think the first thing, and you've already recognized in the question, is you have to recognize this is a system change. In the past, the system as it was structured was a system that did two things. One, it got universally every kid in school, and second, it was much more of a selection system than an education system. And I say this because the best of India are the best of the world. And so often when I say that there's very little learning in Indian schools, I get contradicted by saying, but look at these Booker Prize winners, look at these, scientists, look at the IIT. And I say, yeah, if you take 1 billion people and create this very difficult process of continuing in schooling and getting into these best schools, the people in those best schools will be phenomenal individuals who've survived their schooling. They're not phenomenal individuals who then were augmented by an education. It was a selectorate. So the first thing you have to recognize is the system has to change. And what the system needs to focus on is the system needs to focus on early, foundational, conceptual mastery of skills. Meaning, the Indian curriculum drives kids across coverage. You need to be exposed to this, you need to be exposed to that, you need to be exposed to that, you need to be exposed to that. That's not learning, that's exposure. What you really need is kids who understand the principles of what they're learning and can reason and use those skills. So this is a massive shift for the system. I think in many, many elements of the government, the national government, its national strategy, I think this has been recognized. What we have to recognize is it's going to be a radical shift. There was a recent estimate of what fraction of people as adults could read a single sentence in any language having completed 5 years of schooling. That fraction in India has fallen since the 1950s. So if you went to school in the 1950s, you most likely learned to read. If you went to school in the 1990s, much, much less so. So this isn't just a system in stagnation in spite of the spiraling needs for the economy as the economy gets more sophisticated. This is actually a system in decline on its fundamental learning outcomes. So the change has to be radical. Second, the change has to be thoroughgoing. It has to start from the early grades. You have to rethink what you're teaching and why. And third, you have to sustain it. This isn't a big push you can do it in a year. We've seen, when governments in states and cities go to do this, it's really a wrenching change for a system because in some ways the system was successful. You said put every kid in school. We put every kid in school. And we were designed and built for that purpose. And then to change that purpose to say, okay, now that every kid is in school, we really need them both learning the material and much more in depth. It's a massive change, and I think it's going to take. We have to acknowledge it's going to be big. We have to acknowledge it's going to be hard, and we have to acknowledge it's going to take a long time.
Okay. Do you want to talk to us a little more about how you think we can implement such a change in the system? What steps does the government need to take? I mean, this is a big perspective shift, but are there any easy solutions you can think of to start along this path?
So we have, as part of a long-term research project I've been involved with Oxford University, where I was affiliated, we do have 5 sort of things governments need to do to get started and to make a successful progress. The first, and they all sound like many things, like consultant advice is common sense, but they're not common sense. The first is you have to commit, and you have to commit to outcomes, and you have to commit to learning. We say, well, we are committed to education. Look at what we've done. But often those are commitments to inputs. Those are commitments to process. Those are commitments to spend. Those aren't commitments to learning outcomes. Second, you have to measure what matters. And you have to measure it in a way that's reliable, which is a huge issue in India because the cheating just pervades the system. You have to measure it in a way that's regular, so you get updates on enough frequency that you can manage, and you need to measure in a way that's relevant to the actors. So a lot more formative assessment for in-classroom teachers so they understand what their students understand. So again, when you say measure, you know, we think, oh, we do that already. Nah, not in the way that meets the 3 R's of measurement. Third thing you have to do is you have to support teaching. And again, everybody says, oh, of course we support teachers. That's the problem. You support teachers, not teaching. It's a radical system change to think, how are we going to attract, recruit, and maintain people that are excellent at implementing effective practices of teaching? That's a huge change. And it just changes your whole mindset to think, I'm not supporting teachers, just the person who happens to be in the classroom. I'm supporting teaching. I'm supporting effective teaching. The fourth thing is you have to expect that you will need to adapt what you adopt. You know, oftentimes the search for easy solutions leads you to look, what did the Finnish do? You know, what worked in Germany? What worked? That is just not going to work, and it's going to set India back. Part of the RISE research is we studied Madhya Pradesh's implementation of this, you know, school-specific learning plan thing that had been successful in the UK. Didn't work at all, like complete, total, and again, complete, total implementation of the bare minimum with no impact on teaching and learning practices. And the last thing, and this is in some ways the easiest thing to do, but in other ways at the same time politically and organizationally the hardest, is you have to what we call teach at the right level, which is what Pratham and Asar have been recommending and implementing, what many people have picked up on, the mismatch between the speed with which teachers race through the curriculum and a selection. Because in a selection system, you don't expect every kid to learn, right? But you want coverage for the high-stakes exam. So you just race through the curriculum, and kid gets it, the kid doesn't get it, that's the kid's problem, not the teacher's problem, right? So the first thing you need to do is align the curriculum and expectations with what the system can actually accomplish. So you need to simplify the curriculum. You need to not slow it down in the total amount of children get, but you need to slow it down so to make sure children actually get it. So one of the things we find is that kids they get it in a rote way, but they don't get it in a conceptual way, which means it doesn't create a foundation you can build on. So there's this very famous question, which we talk about, education initiatives. If you show an Indian child a ruler with an object like a pencil on it, they'll tell you the length of the object is where the tip of the pencil is on the ruler. If you then show them a picture where the pencil isn't on 0, they'll still tell you the length of the object is where the tip of the pencil is.
Okay.
Kids in 8th grade, the most frequent answer on a multiple choice exam of a picture of a pencil sitting on a ruler where it starts at 2 and ends at 8 is not 6, it's 8. And this is 8th graders, this is kids. And the problem is you just race through measurement to not really understand the concept of displacement, right?
Yeah.
It was just learned in a rote way. And this applies a whole array of things. They learn it in a very superficial and rote way, enough to regurgitate it on the immediate outcome and the immediate exam, but then that's too narrow to be a foundation. And so when you go to build on it, the whole thing collapses. You really can't make progress. So that's the last thing, is you have to align the system around the learning objectives, which means you have to simplify the system and be more specific about, here are things we really need deep conceptual so that they can apply the knowledge to non-routine situations, not just regurgitate exactly what we gave them back.
We're talking about a lot of changes, but is more spending what is needed here to affect these changes?
More spending on the right things is needed, but more spending in total is just not the issue. You know, as part of the RISE study, Research on Improving Systems of Education, we compared, not we, but some of the researchers compared learning outcomes in Vietnam and India. Learning outcomes in Vietnam on the PISA-like OECD assessment is at US and UK levels. Learning at India is not. far behind. And when they looked, it was just none of the identifiable spending indicators or input indicators explained any of the gap between India and Vietnam. It just isn't the inputs. And when we pressed the Vietnamese researchers, we had these country studies of which India was one and of which Vietnam was one. When we pressed the Vietnamese researchers, we said, "You're telling us a whole bunch of things it's not. What is it really?" They said, Vietnam succeeded because they wanted to. And in the end, no one wants to hear that. They want to hear this is an easy thing, here's a technical thing, we can do what the Finnish did, we can spend more. All of those approaches, if they're decoupled, and this is why I say the first thing governments have to do is commit. So if the system doesn't really deeply penetrated, absorb that its purpose is to convey this learning, nothing will work. More spending won't work. Already you see between public and private in India, the public sector spends 6 times more per person and achieves at best the same student adjusted outcome as the private sector. So more spend isn't necessarily going to help. You may need to spend more to implement these reforms, but just uniform expansion of the system as usual is going to give you what it gave you in the past, and that's not even stagnation, that's deterioration.
I think what we're understanding here is it's a major attitude shift that's needed. And earlier you were talking about how the Indian government has actually started realizing some of these things and making those shifts. So to finish off, I'd just like to ask you, what do you think it looks like for India over the next how many ever decades? I mean, do you think the government is taking the right steps? Do you expect education outcomes to improve? Are you hopeful for India's education?
I first came to India in 1991, and I've been coming back ever since on a regular basis because I'm very optimistic in general about India. But I sometimes think of India succeeds. But there was a famous statement, I think it was Winston Churchill about the Americans, where he said, "The Americans will always do the right thing after they've tried everything else." So in many ways, I'm very optimistic because India is a very dynamic country. It's a federalized country, so there's lots of dynamism coming from the states. It's a unified country that sees itself on the grand scale in a way that's important. And so I feel I'm optimistic in the sense that eventually India will do the right thing after it's tried everything else.
Okay. I think that paints a pretty interesting picture of the education system in India right now. Thank you so much for speaking with us today, Lant.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.